The seasons changed and time continued to move forward. Sarah and Daniel had already faced many storms together, but each new day brought them closer. Their bond was strong not only because of love, but because of the trust and respect that grew. Between them, Sarah was no longer the lonely CEO who spent her nights buried in work. Daniel was no longer the quiet janitor hiding from his past. They had become partners in life, walking side by side through every challenge. Their story had already surprised many people, but it was not finished. It was only beginning to grow deeper. Sarah had always been dedicated to her company, but now she started to dream about other things as well. She thought about building a life outside the walls of glass and metal. She thought about creating a home where peace and warmth lived side by side with success. Daniel, too, began to open his heart to new dreams. For many years, he had lived in silence, thinking only about survival. But now he allowed himself to imagine a future filled with joy. He pictured mornings when he and Sarah would share coffee in a quiet garden, evenings when they would sit by the fire and talk about life. Simple days full of laughter. But the world around them was still watching. One morning, a news article appeared with their picture. The headline spoke about the CEO who had fallen in love with a janitor. Some readers mocked it, some criticized it, but many others admired it. The story spread quickly, and people from outside the company began to notice Sarah's choice. Investors called her, asking questions, but Sarah answered with calm confidence. She said, "My personal life is not up for discussion. My results will speak for me." And she proved her words true. Her company grew stronger than before, showing that her heart and her work could both stand firm. Daniel, however, struggled with the sudden attention. He had lived so long in the shadows that being seen by the world felt strange and heavy. At first, he wanted to step back and disappear again. But Sarah reminded him that his worth was not defined by titles or by public opinion. She told him, "You are not only your past, and you are not only what people say. You are who you choose to be now." And Daniel began to realize she was right. He decided not to run from the light anymore, but to walk in it beside her. Their love was tested again when Sarah faced a tough decision inside the company. A new deal was on the table, one that could bring great profit but also risked hurting many workers. The board pushed her to agree, but Sarah hesitated. She spoke to Daniel about it one evening while they sat together on the balcony of her apartment. The city lights glowed below them. She told him, "I could sign and please the investors, but in my heart I feel it is not right." Daniel listened and then said, "In the field, I learned that not every victory is worth the cost. Sometimes the hardest choice is to protect people instead of chasing numbers." His words gave her courage. The next day, she rejected the deal, even though some board members were angry. But the workers later thanked her for protecting them, and her respect grew even stronger among those who mattered most. As their journey continued, Sarah and Daniel began to share more of themselves. Daniel told her stories from his time as a commander. Not all of them were dark. Some were about the bravery of his men, about the moments of humanity he saw, even in places of war. Sarah listened to every story. She did not judge him for the past. Instead, she admired the man who had survived it and still carried kindness in his heart. For Daniel, sharing these stories was like opening locked doors inside himself. He felt lighter each time he spoke, and he saw that Sarah did not look at him with fear, but with deeper love. Sarah also shared her hidden fears. She told him about the times she cried alone in her office, about the pressure she had felt to never fail. She admitted that sometimes she wondered if all her success was worth the loneliness. Daniel held her hands and told her, "You are not alone anymore. You do not have to carry the weight by yourself." His words were simple, but they gave her more comfort than anything she had ever known. Slowly, the people around them began to change more and more. At first, they had judged them. Now they started to respect them. Employees saw how Daniel treated everyone with kindness, from the highest executive to the newest worker. They saw how Sarah remained strong and fair in her decisions. Together, they became an example not of power and money, but of love and loyalty. One afternoon, Sarah and Daniel visited a small orphanage that her company supported. The children ran to Sarah, calling her name, but soon they also gathered around Daniel. He played with them, taught them simple games, and even told them stories. Sarah watched with glowing eyes. She saw a man who had once carried weapons now carrying laughter to children. She thought to herself, "This is the man I want to spend the rest of my life with." That evening, Sarah and Daniel walked home through the quiet streets. Sarah looked at him and asked softly, "Daniel, do you ever think about marriage?" He stopped and looked at her eyes, glowing under the streetlight. He said, "I never thought I would find someone like you, someone who could heal the parts of me. I thought we're lost. If you want marriage, then my answer is yes." Sarah smiled with tears in her eyes. She had built her empire, alone. But now she knew she did not have to face the future alone. Their story reached a new chapter as they began to plan their life together. They did not care about the gossip of the world anymore. They cared only about the promise they had made to each other. The promise to walk side by side through every challenge. The promise to protect each other's hearts no matter what storms came ahead. Their love had grown from small moments in a lobby into something powerful enough to stand against judgment and fear. As the night grew quiet and the stars shined above Sarah, and Daniel held hands and looked toward the future. For them, it was not about the past or the titles they carried. It was about the simple truth they had found. Love is not about power or wealth. Love is about two hearts that choose each other again and again. And in that glow, they both knew that their journey together was only beginning. The city was bright that evening with lights from tall buildings glowing like stars on earth. Cars rushed past the streets and voices filled the air as people hurried to their homes or to their plans. Inside one of the tallest towers stood a woman whose life looked perfect to the outside world. She was a CEO of a large company, and her name was known in many circles of business. People respected her because she was strong and clever, and she had built a career that few could match. But behind her serious eyes and fine clothes, she carried a fear that she never shared with anyone. That night she was invited to a dinner with powerful investors. It was not just any dinner. It was an evening that could decide the future of her company. Everyone who mattered in her industry would be there. They were men and women who measured strength not only by numbers on paper, but by the life one showed in public. They would arrive with their partners dressed in elegance. They would smile as couples and share stories that showed not only wealth but family and love. She knew how these dinners worked. She had been to many before, and each time she stood alone, she could feel the eyes judging her. She could feel the whispers that questioned why such a powerful woman had no partner at her side. It was a wound she carried quietly. She had no time for love, no space for family, and no hand to hold in moments when the world turned cold. Success had given her money and power, but it had stolen the softer parts of her life. And so on this night, when the invitation came, she told herself she would not walk in alone again. But she had no one to call, no one to trust, no one who could stand beside her and make the world believe she was complete. That was when the idea struck her. It was bold, unusual, and even desperate, but she felt cornered and could not see another way. She would not search for love or friendship. She would pay someone. She would offer enough money to make it impossible to refuse, and that person would act as her partner for one evening only. No questions, no promises, no strings. Just an act that would save her pride in front of people who judged too easily. She thought about it all day, the thought turning in her mind like a restless bird. Then as she walked past a cafe near her office, she saw him. He was sitting by the window with a cup of coffee that had grown cold. His clothes were simple and his shoes worn, but his eyes were steady. There was something in his face that showed both weariness and strength, like a man who had carried heavy burdens but still stood tall. He was not from her world. He did not shine with wealth or power, yet there was something about him that made her stop. She stepped inside the cafe, her heart beating in a strange way. He looked up, surprised when she walked straight to his table. She asked if she could sit, and he nodded slowly. She told him her name, though he seemed already to know who she was. Many people did. Then, without wasting time, she made her offer. $10,000, she said, if he would act as her partner for one evening. Just one evening, no more. The man was silent for a long moment. His hand rested on the cup, and he studied her face with calm eyes. He was not sure if she was joking. Who pays a stranger to act as a partner for dinner? He wanted to laugh, but her eyes were serious, and he realized she was not making fun. She truly needed this. He asked why she had chosen him of all people. She shrugged and said he looked real, and real was what she needed. The truth was he was a single father. His life was not easy. He worked in small jobs, fixing things for neighbors, delivering packages, and sometimes cleaning offices. Every penny went to raising his little daughter, a girl with bright eyes who believed her father was the strongest man in the world. But he was tired. Bills kept piling up, and he often wondered how long he could hold everything together. $10,000 was not just money. It was hope. It was food on the table, clothes for his child, a roof that would not leak in the rain. So even though the offer felt strange, even though part of him wanted to refuse, he nodded and agreed. She told him the date and time, and he promised he would be there. He did not own a fine suit, only an old one that had hung in his closet for years, but he decided it would have to do. As he walked home that night, the weight of his decision sank in. He had agreed to play a role in a world that was not his. He wondered if he would embarrass her, if he would say the wrong thing, if the rich people would see through the act. But then he thought of his daughter and the way her eyes would shine when he bought her the bed she had been asking for, or the coat she needed for winter. That picture was enough to push away his fear. The CEO, on the other hand, sat in her office long after the lights of the building had gone dark. She stared at her reflection in the glass wall and asked herself why she had chosen him. Out of all the men she could have hired, why him? She thought about his quiet eyes, his steady voice, the way he did not seem impressed by her name or her wealth. It puzzled her. For the first time in many years, she felt unsure of herself. She was used to being in control, but now she was stepping into something she could not predict. The night of the dinner was drawing near, and both of them prepared in their own way. He with his worn suit and nervous thoughts, she with her polished dress and restless heart. Two lives from different worlds were about to walk side by side, and neither of them knew that the choice they had made would open a door that neither expected. The evening of the dinner arrived, and the city seemed to shine brighter than usual. The tall hotels stood like giants against the sky, their glass walls reflecting the golden lights of the streets below. Inside one of these places, a grand ballroom was prepared for the gathering of powerful people. The tables were covered with white cloth, the plates shone like silver, and candles flickered in tall holders, casting a warm glow over the room. Guests were arriving in pairs, dressed in gowns and suits that spoke of wealth and influence. Laughter and soft music floated in the air as servers moved quietly with trays of wine and delicate food. The CEO stepped out of her car at the entrance. She wore a dress that was elegant but simple, the kind of dress that spoke of confidence more than decoration. Her heels clicked softly against the marble floor as she entered. But even with her graceful presence, she felt the familiar pressure building inside. She knew the whispers would start if she stood alone for too long. People would smile to her face but judge behind her back. She had lived that before, and tonight she had sworn it would be different. She waited near the door for a moment, her eyes searching the crowd until she saw him. He was walking toward her, his old suit pressed as neatly as he could manage. His shoes shined through the leather was worn. His hair was combed carefully, and though he looked simple compared to the polished men around him, he walked with a quiet dignity that caught her attention. He gave a small smile as he reached her, and she felt a wave of relief. He had come. She placed her hand on his arm, and together they walked into the ballroom. The room turned toward them, curious eyes studying the pair. Some guests whispered, wondering who the man was. He was not a familiar face from the business world, nor did he carry the air of wealth. But there was something in his steady step and calm gaze that silenced mockery before it could form. He did not look like a man pretending. He looked like a man who belonged wherever he stood. At the table, the investors greeted her warmly, and she introduced him as her partner. His handshake was firm, his eyes sincere. The men expected small talk about money and business, but instead he spoke about simple things. He told a story about fixing a neighbor's roof during a storm, about his daughter who loved to draw pictures of stars, about the importance of keeping promises even when life was hard. His words were plain, but they carried a truth that touched the listeners. Slowly, the table leaned toward him, asking more questions, smiling at his humor, nodding at his wisdom. The CEO sat beside him in silence, watching in amazement. She had feared he would not fit in, feared he would stumble or embarrass her. Instead, he had done what she could never do. He had made these powerful people see beyond titles and money. He had made them feel something real. She felt a strange warmth rising inside her, a mix of pride and wonder. One of the investors, a man known for his sharp tongue, leaned across the table and asked the man what he thought of success. The room grew quiet, waiting for his answer. The man thought for a moment, then said success was not about money or fame. Success was going to bed knowing you had done right by the people who depended on you. Success was watching your child smile because you had given them your time. The room fell silent for a moment, and then the investor nodded slowly as if he had heard something he had forgotten long ago. The CEO felt her chest tighten. She had spoken about success 1,000 times using numbers, charts, and speeches, but his simple answer carried more weight than all her polished words. She looked at him and saw not just a man filling a role, but a man who lived by truths that money could not buy. The night continued with music and laughter. Couples danced on the floor and he offered his hand to her. She hesitated, for she was not used to being led, but then she allowed him to guide her. They moved slowly to the music and she felt the strange calm of being seen not as a CEO, but as a woman. She realized she had forgotten what it was like to be looked at with kindness instead of calculation. His eyes did not measure her power. They simply held her as if she mattered. As they returned to the table, she excused herself and stepped toward the balcony that overlooked the glowing city. She needed air, for her heart was unsettled. She had brought him here as a shield, a mask to hide her loneliness. But now she found herself shaken by the honesty of his presence. She thought about her years of chasing contracts, her endless meetings, her empty penthouse. She had all the things people admired, yet here was a man with so little, and he had managed to command more respect in one night than she had in years. She leaned against the railing, staring at the lights below, and for the first time in a long while, her eyes burned with tears. She quickly wiped them away as she heard his steps behind her. He stood quietly beside her, not asking questions, just sharing the silence. For a moment, the noise of the party felt far away, and the two of them stood in a small pocket of peace. She whispered that she had offered him money to protect her pride, but what he had given her tonight was something money could never buy. He looked at her gently and said, "Sometimes people forget that truth is stronger than appearances." His words sank into her heart like stones dropping into still water, sending ripples through every layer of her being. The dinner ended, and guests began to leave, shaking hands and exchanging smiles. The investors congratulated her on her choice of partner, saying he was refreshing, different, unforgettable. She nodded politely, but inside she was trembling. She had not expected any of this. She had not expected to feel moved, to feel seen, to feel small and yet safe at the same time. When they stepped outside, the night air was cool and the city hummed softly around them. He thanked her for trusting him and said he would use the money to give his daughter things she needed. His voice was calm, but his eyes glowed with hope. She listened, her chest heavy with emotions she could not name. She had once believed money was the answer to every problem. Yet tonight she had seen how little it truly meant compared to love, dignity, and kindness. She turned away for a moment, hiding the tears that had escaped. He did not press her, only waited patiently. For the first time in years, she let the tears fall freely, not from weakness but from the breaking of walls she had built too high. That night, as they parted, both carried something new inside. For him, it was the hope that tomorrow could be brighter for his daughter. For her, it was the realization that the richest lives are not measured in wealth, but in the simple truths that make people cry with honesty. The morning after the dinner, the CEO woke up in her large apartment filled with silence. The tall windows let in the light of the rising sun, but the rooms around her felt empty. She had walked through those rooms for years without thinking, but after the night before she felt the emptiness more strongly than ever. The sound of laughter from the dinner, the way his eyes lit up when he spoke of his daughter, the way people listened to him even without power or money, all of it stayed in her mind. She had wanted him to play a part, but instead he had opened a part of her she had buried. At first she told herself it was just one evening and she should move on. She tried to focus on her papers and meetings, on the contracts waiting for her signature. But every time she picked up a pen, her mind drifted back to him. She wondered what he was doing, wondered what his daughter looked like, wondered if he was already spending the money on something meaningful. It was strange for her to think so much about someone she barely knew, yet she could not stop. He, on the other hand, woke up in his small apartment where the walls carried the marks of years of struggle. His daughter was already awake, sitting on the floor with her notebook, drawing stars and houses like she always did. When she looked up and smiled at him, the tiredness in his bones faded. He told her he had good news, that soon she would have a proper bed, warm clothes, and maybe even the art supplies she always dreamed about. She laughed and clapped her hands, and her joy filled the room more than sunlight ever could. He thought of the woman who had given him this chance. He had not planned to be part of her world, but now he could not forget the way she had looked at him on the balcony, as if she was searching for something she had lost long ago. He knew she had money, but he had seen a loneliness in her eyes that money could not hide. Days passed, and the CEO could not push away the thought of seeing him again. Finally, she asked her driver to take her to the address he had written down when she paid him. The car drove away from the shining streets of her world into the quieter corners of the city. The buildings grew smaller, the roads narrower, and children played on the sidewalks with worn toys. She felt out of place, yet strangely drawn forward. When the car stopped, she stepped out and saw him standing by the door of a small apartment block. His daughter was with him, holding his hand, her eyes curious. The girl was thin, but her smile was bright, and she looked up at her father with trust that melted the CEO's heart. For a moment, she forgot who she was supposed to be. She forgot the weight of her name and her company. She was simply a woman standing in front of a man and his child. He welcomed her inside, a little uncertain of how she would see his world. The apartment was small, the furniture old, but everything was clean and cared for. On the table lay his daughter's drawings, stars scattered across paper in colors of blue and gold. The CEO bent down to look at them, her fingers brushing the simple lines, and the girl shyly explained each picture. She spoke of how she wanted to be an artist one day, how she dreamed of painting skies so large they could not fit on paper. The CEO listened with a soft smile, feeling a warmth she had not felt in years. They shared tea at the small table. The cups were chipped, the tea was simple. Yet it tasted more honest to her than any fine drink she had ever had in her glass-walled meetings. She watched the father speak gently to his daughter, watched how he made her laugh with silly jokes, how he reminded her to eat slowly, how he listened when she talked about her stars. The CEO felt as if she was peeking into another world, one she had never known existed, a world built not on money but on love and care. As the day went on, she offered to take them both out. They walked together in a nearby park where trees swayed and children ran with kites. The girl ran ahead, her laughter filling the air, while the CEO walked beside the man. He spoke about his struggles without shame, how life had been hard but worth it for the sake of his daughter. He told her about nights when he skipped meals so the child could eat, about mornings when he carried hope even when his pockets were empty. His words were simple but heavy with truth, and she listened in silence, each sentence pressing against her heart. When the girl grew tired, they sat on a bench. The CEO handed the child a small gift she had brought, a set of new colored pencils. The girl's eyes widened as if she had been given a treasure, and she hugged them to her chest. The CEO felt tears rise again, but this time she did not hide them. The father noticed and placed his hand gently on her shoulder, not saying anything, just letting her be. That evening, when she returned to her empty apartment, she could not look at her polished walls the same way. She realized she had lived for years surrounded by glass and silence while in that small apartment, with its chipped cups and crowded corners. There had been more warmth than she had ever known. She lay awake in bed thinking of the girl's smile, the man's steady voice, and the way her heart had felt lighter in their presence. The next morning she made a decision that surprised even herself. She cleared her schedule, canceled a meeting, and went back to visit them. Each time she visited, she learned something new about their lives. She watched the girl draw with her new pencils, watched the father cook meals with careful hands, watched how they faced every day with strength and hope despite having so little. She began to realize that she was learning more from them than she had ever learned in her years of business. Her company continued to run, her name continued to carry weight. But inside, she was changing. The mask she wore for the world was beginning to crack, and behind it she was finding a softer, truer self. The man never asked her for more money, never treated her like someone above him. He spoke to her simply as if she was just another person, and she found that more freeing than anything she had ever known. Slowly, she began to imagine what life could look like if it was not built only on contracts and power, but on connection and care, and though she had not yet spoken it aloud, She knew she was no longer the same woman who had paid him $10,000 to act as her partner. Something deeper was happening. Something she could not control but could not stop either. Days began to turn into weeks, and the connection between the CEO and the small family grew stronger with each passing moment. What had started as a one-night act was now becoming something neither of them had planned. She found herself leaving her office earlier than before just to visit them. She brought simple gifts for the girl, like books of stories or small sets of paints. But more than the gifts, it was her presence that made the child glow with joy. The girl would run to the door when she arrived and take her hand as if she had always been a part of their lives. The father noticed the change too. He had accepted her into their small world carefully at first, not sure what it would mean. But soon he saw that she was not visiting out of pity or guilt. She was coming because she truly wanted to. She laughed more easily when she was with them. She asked questions about his daughter's dreams and listened to his own stories without judgment. Sometimes she even sat on the floor with the girl, helping her draw or reading out loud from the books she brought. For a woman who had lived behind glass walls for so long, she was learning how to be real again. At the same time, her business world continued to press on her. The investors were happy with her after the dinner and wanted to see more of her confidence and strength. Meetings piled up. Contracts demanded her focus. Some of her partners even asked about the man who had been with her that night. They assumed he was someone powerful, hidden from their circles. She smiled politely and gave no answers. Inside, she was torn. She knew she could not explain the truth because the truth was too strange. How could she tell them she had hired him, and then somehow he had become the one person who made her feel alive? One evening, she sat in her office after a long meeting. Papers were stacked in front of her, but her thoughts were not on them. She looked out the window at the glowing skyline and asked herself a question she had avoided for weeks. What mattered more now? The world she had built with so much effort, or the new world she was discovering with him and his daughter? She had always believed she knew the answer. Money and power were everything, but now the certainty was breaking apart. She decided to step away from the city noise and joined them one weekend on a trip to a small park near the river. The girl ran barefoot in the grass chasing butterflies while the father and the CEO sat nearby. The air was fresh with the smell of trees and the sound of water. For the first time, she felt like she could breathe without pressure. He spoke about simple things like how his daughter loved to sleep under the stars on warm nights, or how she once made him laugh by painting the walls with her crayons. The CEO listened with quiet wonder. She had lived surrounded by luxury, but none of those memories had the warmth of his. Later that evening, when the girl fell asleep in her father's arms, the CEO offered to carry her bag. It was a small act, but it made her feel closer to them. She found herself watching the child sleep peacefully and her chest filled with emotions she could not name. It was as if a hidden part of her heart was waking up. She realized she wanted to protect this little family, even though she had never known what it meant to protect anyone outside of contracts and employees. But with new feelings came new fears. That night she lay awake in her apartment thinking about what people would say if they found out. She was a woman of power. He was a man with little money. Their worlds were different in every way. Would the investors laugh? Would her colleagues lose respect? Would people accuse her of weakness? She had lived too long worrying about how she appeared. Yet she also knew she could no longer go back to who she was before. One afternoon, she invited them to her apartment for the first time. She wanted to share her space with them even though it was so different from theirs. The girl ran from room to room, amazed by the size and the shining walls. But then she turned to the CEO and said softly that the apartment felt too quiet. The CEO felt a sting in her chest at those words because the child had spoken the truth. For years she had lived in silence with no laughter bouncing off the walls. Seeing the girl walk through the rooms made her realize how empty it all had been. The father looked around politely, but she could see the discomfort in his eyes. He did not belong to that world of glass and steel. Yet he was not embarrassed. He stood with calmness as if he knew his own worth no matter the size of the walls around him. She admired that strength deeply. She told herself quietly that maybe true wealth was not about the place you lived in, but about how you lived inside it. Their bond grew deeper, and people began to notice changes in her. Her assistants whispered that she smiled more often now. Her meetings felt less tense. She even began to make decisions that cared more for the workers of her company than for the pure numbers. Some of her colleagues found this strange, but others respected her even more. What they did not know was that her time with him and his daughter was teaching her lessons no business school could ever teach. But storms were waiting ahead. One evening while she was leaving her office, she overheard two investors speaking about her. They were praising her leadership but mocking the man who had been at her side that night. They said he was too simple for her world and wondered why she had chosen him. Their laughter cut through her like a blade. She realized then how harsh the world could be when it judged without knowing. She walked away without showing emotion, but inside she was shaken. That night she visited him and his daughter again. As soon as the girl ran into her arms, she felt the laughter from those men fade away. She sat with them through dinner, eating a simple meal of bread and soup, and found more peace in that moment than in any rich feast she had ever attended. Still, she knew the world outside would not stop judging. She knew she would have to make a choice soon. She looked at him across the table, at his tired but kind face, and at his daughter, who was showing her another drawing of stars, and she asked herself in silence if she was strong enough to choose what her heart wanted over what the world expected. The answer was not yet clear, but she felt it moving inside her like a seed growing in the dark. The next morning came softly, with light slipping through the curtains of the small apartment. The CEO had stayed the night because the little girl had begged her not to leave. She woke to the sound of pans clattering and the smell of tea rising from the kitchen. The father was already awake, preparing breakfast with quiet hands that moved like someone who had been doing this for years without complaint. The girl was drawing again at the table, her small hands full of colors, and she looked up with a bright smile when she saw the CEO step into the room. It felt strange to her that this place, which was once only a small corner in their lives, had become a home for her heart. She sat with them at the table, drinking tea that was simple and warm, and eating bread that was not from a fine bakery, but tasted sweeter than anything she had eaten at banquets. She laughed when the girl showed her the new drawing of three people holding hands beneath a sun, and she realized with a sudden ache that the drawing was of them as a family. The father noticed her pause and the way her eyes lingered on the picture. He said nothing, but in his silence she felt both comfort and question. She wanted to say aloud that she wished it was true that they were already family, but her world was still complicated, and her fear of what people might say still held pieces of her back. She smiled gently and praised the drawing, but inside her chest, something stirred deeply. Later that day, the CEO returned to her office, where stacks of files and flashing screens reminded her of the life she was expected to lead. Her assistant hurried in with schedules, meetings, and phone calls. Investors were pressing again, demanding updates about the man she had brought to the dinner. Some threatened to step back if they felt her choices were reckless. She listened, but her mind drifted back to the warm tea, the child's laugh, and the steady way the father's hands moved as he cooked. By evening, she stood at her large window staring at the city spread beneath her. She realized she was standing at a crossroad. One road led to safety and power and reputation, where she could please investors and continue as she always had, alone and untouchable. The other road led to an uncertain path filled with whispers and judgment, but also laughter and drawings and hands she wanted to hold. For years she had chosen the safe road, but now her heart was pulling her toward the uncertain one. Days passed, and she began to spend more time in the small apartment than in her own grand home. She found herself helping the little girl with homework, making tea alongside the father, and even fixing a curtain that had fallen loose. She laughed at herself as she stood on a small chair hammering a nail, because she had never done such a thing before in her life. Yet in that simple act she felt more human and alive than at any award ceremony she had ever attended. One night, as rain poured heavily, outside they all sat together under a blanket watching the drops race down the glass. The little girl fell asleep between them, her head resting on the CEO's shoulder. In the dim light, she turned and looked at the father. His eyes were soft, his face tired but calm. She whispered, almost afraid of the sound of her own voice, that she was afraid of losing everything if she chose them openly. He answered quietly that sometimes losing everything meant gaining what really mattered. His words sank into her heart like stones falling into still water, sending ripples of truth through her. Not long after that conversation, she was faced with a choice she could no longer avoid. A major investor demanded she attend a global conference where questions about her personal life were expected to surface again. Her team advised her to go alone and avoid risk. For a full night, she could not sleep, pacing her large apartment, torn between fear and longing. At dawn, she finally made her choice. When the day of the conference arrived, she walked onto the grand stage with the father and his daughter beside her. The cameras flashed and murmurs spread quickly across the hall. People whispered louder than before, pointing and questioning. Some laughed quietly, others frowned. She stood at the podium, her hands steady and her voice strong. She told the audience that her life had been built on power and wealth, but those things had not given her peace. She said she had found peace in places no one expected, in the smile of a child, in the dignity of a man, who lived honestly in the warmth of a small home that had no marble floors but held real love. As she spoke, her eyes filled with tears that she did not try to hide. She admitted that she once offered him $10,000 just to pretend, but now she would give everything she owned just to keep them in her life. The hall was silent for a long moment. Then scattered applause began. Some stood and clapped with respect. Others looked confused or disapproving, but she no longer cared. For the first time, she was not acting for anyone, she was speaking only truth. After the conference, they left the stage together. She held his hand openly, and the little girl skipped beside them with a bright smile. Outside the hall, the air was cool, and she felt lighter than she had in years. She knew battle still waited ahead, critics, investors, and endless voices of doubt, but she also knew she was no longer walking alone. That night, they returned to the small apartment, where bread, soup, and laughter welcomed them again. She looked around at the peeling paint, the uneven floor, the small table crowded with papers and crayons. She realized that this place, which had once seemed so ordinary, now shone brighter than all the glass towers of the city, because here she was not a CEO or a symbol. She was simply a woman who loved and was loved in return. She sat quietly watching the father clean up, and the girl hum softly as she drew another picture. The tears came again, but these were tears of peace. She understood at last that her greatest wealth was not her company or her power. It was this family she had found by accident through an offer that had started as fear, but had led her to the truth she needed most. And in that glow she smiled, through her tears, knowing that no matter what storms came, she would never face them alone again.